And wouldn't you know, here in California, Silicon Valley area, there is the Institute for the Future, and they consult with the largest organizations in the world on helping them think about and not just plan, but like how do you get your mind around the future? And we're like, you know what? We need that voice at this conference. We need to help us as individuals, families, communities, organizations get our mind wrapped around this idea of how you map out the future. And so we were connected with our next speaker, Gabe Cervantes, who is research manager at the Institute for the Future. And Gabe is a spectrum diversity futurist exploring the nuances of identity formation and expression as they relate to the notions of space and place. His forecasting is focused on racial, ethnic, gender, age, and thought diversity and how it will come to shape future workforces and leadership. Gabe's research is focused on the next generation of youth and the impacts they will bring as they begin entering the workforce and culture. And grounded in diaspora studies, Gabe's interests lie in leadership development and how spectral diversity will play a key role in the future of organizations. Gabe and us, we had several conversations leading up to this. And what we're so excited about is that we kind of came to this place on this session of the future of the disability experience. And so I'm really excited, and hope you are too, to welcome Gabe Cervantes from the Institute for the Future to join us. Welcome, Gabe.
Jordan, thank you so much. Destiny, thank you for being with us and helping us out with ASL translation. Hello, everyone. I'm Gabe Cervantes. I'm a research manager at the Institute for the Future. And if we could throw up my slides, that would be wonderful. The Institute for the Future, we are a nonprofit futures think tank based in Silicon Valley. We can advance to the next slide. We are right across the street from Stanford University. So if you ever have the opportunity, swing by, you will see a lot of orange, you will see a lot of green, and a lot of quotes on our outside windows about the future. Next slide, please. We are a 50-plus-year-old organization, originally a spinoff of the RAND Corporation. We help organizations that, as Jordan mentioned, really all size of organizations across the globe combat short-termism. This notion of only focusing on the short term or the near present, helping people think more strategically, more imaginatively about the long-term future in order to build resiliency. We do this by focusing on urgent futures, connective technologies, and transformation to daily life. Now, the important thing to understand about what we do is we are not in the business of predicting the future. We do not believe anyone can accurately predict the future. And we say many times, if someone tells you that they can predict the future, you shouldn't believe them. Especially if they're from California, especially if they're from Silicon Valley, where the speed and the rate and the change of innovation happens far too quickly. Next slide, please. So if we can't predict the future, what we can do is learn how to think about the future in a systematic way, learning how to turn uncertainty into inspiration for action and increase resiliency. So my goal today is to help you understand how to do that, to give you a glimpse into how we're able to do that. As we move on to the next slide, it's important to understand the difference between predictions and what we do, which is forecasting. Now, predictions are all about getting the future correct. Predictions, by their very nature, can be argued with by anyone for any reason. By its very definition, predictions are purposefully narrow. They try to hone in and target on a specific event, on a specific moment. And finally, predictions lose value as the future comes to life. As we roll out into the future, our predictions lose their value because we either arrive to those predictions or we stray further and further away from them. Next slide, please. In turn, forecast. The goal of a forecast is not to predict, it's to provoke. So we care not about the accuracy, we care about the provocation that a forecast arises out of a forecast. Many times, unlike a prediction, we want our forecast to be wrong. For example, when we're talking about future of climate change, future of climate disruption, and the forecasts around that, I hope that our forecasts for that future will be proven wrong. I hope that we will act today and get us to avoid some of those doom and gloom forecasts that we've been working on recently. Now, forecasts are not designed to be argued with. Forecasts, we accept the premise of a forecast, and all we're asked to do is to react and respond to the given forecast. How do we react? What knee-jerk reactions arise out of the forecast? How do we think we would respond if this future were to come to life? And finally, the best forecasts are all-encompassing. They are broad and encompass various points of views. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is. Now, going on to the next slide, what is futures thinking? What is this guy who claims to be a futurist? What does that even mean? Well, as we go to the next slide, as we look back at human history, we understand that thinking about and planning for the future are core to being human. Next slide, please. It is embedded in our very nature to think about the long-term future. And so I'm going to list off just very quickly a couple examples of what thinking about the future looks like. So next slide. A futurist or a futurist thinking can be a city government. Trying to understand what is the makeup of their future city going to be and what kinds of community services and resources will need to be implemented for future citizens. Next slide. Futures thinking can also be a technology company. We see many of those around us today. A technology company anticipating what are the long-term ethics and social consequences of new products, of new services. Will the technologies that we're building today be used for good or used for harm in unintentional ways? Next slide. Futures thinking is also a university, planning and thinking, what is the future of work? What new skills, what new degrees, what new courses will our students need to have in order to prepare them for the future? Next slide, please. Futures thinking is also an artist. Nick just talked about some of this, right? Artists looking to inspire others with visions of what the possible future could look like. What are the biggest, most positive changes that we can imagine? How do we bring that to the forefront in an easy to digest format? Next slide, please. Futures thinking is also a CEO, thinking about leading their company into the future over various disruptions and change. What can your company start to do today to prepare for what lies ahead? Next slide. Futures thinking is an activist trying to convince people to act together. Go back to my example of climate change. How can we paint a picture of how bad things need to get before we convince people to start to act and make change today? Next slide. Futures thinking is also, if we go to the next slide, futures thinking is also a food manufacturer, thinking about what are the new trends in diet, health, food technologies. What will our food look like in the future? How will people react to different kinds of foods and sources from which our food come from? Next slide. Very present in today's world, futures thinking is a group of scientists trying to figure out how do we respond to the next deadly pandemic? How do we get people to work together to combat a virus that doesn't care about borders, that doesn't care about nationalities, that doesn't care about political differences? How do we work together to combat a common threat? Next slide. Futures thinking is an organization helping refugees as the world becomes more chaotic, as more people move about the globe. How do we figure out what resources we need to place in what area and respond with aid and resources as quickly as the next threat, as the next war, as the next outbreak comes out? And finally, as we go into the next slide, futures thinking is you. Those of you here present in this conference today, thinking about life in the future. What are the changes that we want to carry with us? What are the things that we want to leave behind? What actions can we take today? And what can we start to do now to get us to a brighter, a more positive, and a more inclusive future. Now, really quickly, as we go into the next slide, I'm curious to know who is out there in the virtual room, who is out in the virtual space. So if we go to the next slide, there's a prompt here, and I encourage all of you to go into the chat and tell us what kind of a futures practitioner you are. And the easiest way to do this is to think, I am an X interested in the future of Y. Now, if we roll out the slide, we have some examples here. So for example, we could say, I am, a musician. I'm a musician that is interested in the future of music. And what is music going to look like? What are scores going to look like in the future as AI and artificial intelligence have the ability to create music? If we can click to the next slide, please. You can also say, I am a parent interested in the future of mental health for our kids. Or I am an avid social media user interested in how I can bring my full identity to Web 3.0 and the metaverse as it rolls out and becomes a norm in our future. So take just a second, think through, and put in the chat, what kind of future practitioners do we have in the room with us today? I would love to see as many responses as possible. Wonderful. Now, if we go to the next slide, as those start to come in, what are some of the reasons why people work with the future? Well, first off, people work with the future to imagine things that don't yet exist. We work with the future to think, what are the possibilities for our future that do not exist today, and how do we bring those to life in the next 10 years? We also work with the future to challenge assumptions. Oftentimes, these long-held assumptions about what can and can't happen, and think through, is there a possibility to flip those assumptions on its head and lead us to a better future? Thinking with the future and working with the future helps us create shared long-term perspectives, understanding multiple points of views, and also anticipating long-term threats and uncertainties. That's why we work with the future. Now, thank you so much for those of you who are putting in the chat. I see some parents, caregivers, behavioral analysts, some really, really important futurists here in the room. If you haven't looked, please take a look. Cheryl's a grandparent. Rita is a parent advocate. A lot of parents here. Diana, a service provider interested in the future of employment opportunities. Kurt, Brooke, thank you so much for being here and for putting on your futures hat. So as we go to the next slide, my goal, my ambition for you today, your goal should be to help you sense, develop, communicate, and facilitate core insights that support, challenge, or add nuances to the current ways of thinking about people with disabilities and their need for the future. So I'm going to equip you with a couple of different tools, a couple of different tricks that allow you to do that allow you to say, listen, up to date, we've thought about, we've talked about, we've made these assumptions about people with disabilities. But looking out to the future is yet unwritten. The future is unknowable in the sense that it's open to any possibility. So what can we look at today? What evidence can we look at today to understand what new possibilities there are for the future? So the next slide, I've talked about what futures thinking is and why people do it. Now, people don't naturally think about the future because it's inherently difficult. And as the world's longest running futures organization, we've done a lot of research and a lot of study into why this is. And we've boiled it down to 4 common traps. 4 common traps that make futures thinking difficult. And so I'm going to share those with you and explain what strategies you can start to implement to help you overcome that difficulty. So as we go into the first trap, the next slide, futures thinking is hard first and foremost because we have a bias towards precision metrics. Now, surprisingly or not surprisingly, the more precise a number is, the more precise a metric is, the greater the tendency is to believe it. So we have a bias towards precision metrics. And as you can see here, this is a report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the US Department of Labor, released in early February 2020, that talked about persons with disabilities and what they mean for the labor force. How involved are they in the labor force? And you can see that the metrics is that less than 20%, if I'm reading this correctly, less than 20% of people with disabilities are in the workforce, are contributing members of the labor force, of the labor market. Now, the way we combat thinking about these precision metrics as we go into the next slide is to look not just for quantitative data, but qualitative data as well. So on the next slide, please, we see here an example of a coffee shop that started here in the US, a coffee shop that employs 100% of their employees are people with a disability or with a disability. And so our job when we're thinking about the future is not just to look at the metrics, not just to look at the numbers, but look for qualitative data. Look for examples like this coffee shop that started off as one shop and is now up to 17 or more coffee shops around the US. There are now, the latest the news for this coffee shop is there are franchise opportunities, right? This is a future where if we grow this kind of opportunity, if we grow these kinds of businesses, we can flip that less than 20% number completely on its head and have it be a far greater number 10 years in the future. Next slide, please. The second reason why thinking about the future is hard is there are official futures. There are official futures all around us. Oftentimes, we can't operate without having an official future. The government tells us what our official future is. Organizations like Easter Seals and others represented here today have an official future. That's the way we move forward in our world. But listening to the official future can't be the only future that we think about. Oftentimes, people or parents or grandparents, caregivers of people with disabilities, hear an official future, an official diagnosis from someone like a doctor. Our job, as we go into the next slide, our job is to challenge consensus forecasts. Our job is to take official futures and consider them, wholly, but don't stop there. Go out and find alternative points of views. Now, this is probably one of my favorite examples. Kaylin Bennett is a young man who is the first known person to be recruited to a Division I basketball team, being the first person diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So Kaylin Bennett, his mother, gave an interview where early on when Kaylin was born, in the first few years of his infancy, the doctor told the mother, the official future for your son is he will never walk, he will never talk, he will never communicate with people around him. But go out 20 or more years later, and Kaylin Bennett is the first person with autism to be recruited to a Division I university basketball team. Now, as we go into the next slide, I went back and I looked to see what was the latest. And not only has he been recruited, but he was also scored his very first basket. And so ESPN did a highlight, and I highly encourage you to go out and see the incredible basket that Kaylin was able to make. So again, don't just think about official futures. Go out and find different voices, different opinions that challenge that official future. Next slide, please. The third reason why futures thinking is hard. This is human nature. There's anxiety about change, especially in today's world. In the last 2 years, the entire world has been rocked by COVID-19. Change, rapid change, brings about a lot of anxiety. So as we go into the next slide, the way we combat that is to help people recognize their sources of personal and structural stress. How does understanding where the stress and the anxiety come from help you understand how that might cloud your judgment? Now, the example that I found here is actually what they call the Bat Cave at UC Berkeley in Berkeley, California. It is a basement hideaway for kids, for students who for many, many years suffered with blindness or other debilitating disabilities. And they realized that they created a safe space for them, not just to work and learn, but to innovate. And birthed out of the cave from UC Berkeley are incredible inventions, incredible inventors who have gone on to assist companies like Apple, companies like Facebook, companies like Google better represent people with disabilities and the challenges and the struggles that they have. Highly encourage you to go out and find and read up on the Bat Cave, where the bats hang out over at UC Berkeley. Next slide, please. The fourth and final reason why thinking about the future is difficult is because your future self is a stranger. Now, there's been actual neuroscience done on this. So on the next slide, we show a study that was done by neuroscientists. And neuroscientists put these participants into fMRI scans. And the researchers went to the participants as they were studying their brains and brain activity, and they asked the participants, tell me about yourself. And as the person talked about themselves, the medial prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain, would light up, it would activate. So the researchers went back and asked them to talk about someone they were intimately familiar with, a spouse, a parent, a child, or a best friend. Now, as the person talked about someone they were familiar with, that part of the brain activated. Not as strongly, but it still showed a lot of brain activity. So the researchers went back a third time and said, now talk to me about a complete stranger, someone you know very little about, maybe your neighbor 2 blocks down the street, or the new hire that just started last week. Tell me about that person. And interestingly enough, when the participants talked about complete strangers, the front part of the brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, did not activate. It did not light up at all. So the researchers said, well, let's try one more time. So they went back into the rooms a fourth time, and they said, we're going to go back to talking about yourself. But tell me about yourself in the future. What is your job in 10 years? What college will your kids be at in 20 years? How close to retirement are you going to be in 30 years? And interestingly enough, the same phenomenon that happened when the participants were talking about strangers happened when they were talking about themselves in a future state. The medial prefrontal cortex did not activate. So thinking about yourself in a future state is thinking about a complete stranger, thinking about someone you know absolutely nothing about. And that's why it's inherently difficult for us to put ourselves in a future scenario, in a future situation, and really think about how we would react, how we would respond, and what's the kind of world we would live in the future. So the next slide, please. The way we combat this fourth and final trap is to design processes that help us pre-experience the future. How do we make the future vivid in the present? And I got to tell you, that's what we're doing here today. That's what the conference organizers have set out to do. That's why you're hearing all of these experts. That's why you're engaging in all of these conversations, to help you get stuck out of being in the present and jumping out to the future, putting yourself in those future scenarios and situations and saying, is this a world that I like? Is this a world that I'm okay with? Or is this a world where I don't want to be in? And I realize we need to do something drastic today to avoid us getting into that future. Next slide, please. The famous science fiction author William Gibson wrote, "The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed." And so, what Gibson writes about and what Gibson talks about is the future is already here. It just exists on the fringes. It hasn't been mainstream, and many people don't pay attention to it. So, what we do, what makes us futurists and what makes us successful in our forecasts is going out and finding those unevenly distributed futures happening in the present. So the examples that I gave you of the Bat Cave at UC Berkeley, of Kaylin Bennett, of the coffee shop, Biddy and Boo's coffee shop throughout the globe, those are signals of change. Next slide, please. That's what we call a signal of change. These small or local innovations that happen on the fringe that have the potential to drive positive change into the future. So our goal and my challenge to those of you here today and who are going to continue throughout this conference is don't just think about the future trends. Don't just think about the mainstream ideas, the conversations we're all used to having. Think about the signals of change. Think about those small or local innovations that have the potential to scale, that have the potential to transform our life and really challenge the assumptions of yesterday and help us build futures that we've never imagined, that we've never deemed possible before. Look for the signals of change. Go out, share those with legislators, share those with organizations, share those with each other, and ask yourself, how does this small local innovation, if it were to scale, impact our future? And with that, as we turn to the final slide, I just want to thank you all for including me in this conversation. As someone once said, the future is dark, and that is the best thing it can be. And when they were talking about the future being dark, they didn't mean scary. They just meant dark as unwritten. The future is unwritten, and the potential for us, the ability for us, is to go onto a blank canvas, to go into a dark space and completely write and transform a brand new future. On the final slide, I know there was a question about email contact. So if we throw up the final slide, you will see our website, iftf.org. You can reach out to me anytime. Just on the next slide, please. My email address is there, and also some social media links. Thank you so much for including me. I think we have a couple minutes, Jordan, for questions. So I'm sure you've been keeping track of those. Any questions from the audience or from yourself?
Yeah, it looks like, thank you so much, Gabe. Looks like Tony there wrote down one of your prompts there about and what they were trying to achieve in the future. And if there are more questions in the chat, I know they will be posted there in a second. I have one question for you, Gabe, and that is, have you guys ever worked sort of, or what would be your suggestions for sort of at the policy level for organizations, as this is a policy conference, that are looking at policies, systemic changes, communities as whole, when you're really talking about perhaps inequities, or you're talking about changes that you want to see not only in policy, but even in how society reacts. We're talking really large scale changes and looking to forecast, how do we position ourselves for that as a community as a whole? Have you guys thought much about that, and any thoughts, insights on sort of for a whole community?
Absolutely, Jordan. Thank you for that question. I think my answer is in two parts. And the first is, it is so important when we're trying to combat these long-standing policies or these long-standing notions that have been unfair and unequal, is to make sure that there's adequate representation, not just skin color and nationality, but also thought diversity, also ability, right? Jordan, as you were presenting, I was thinking to myself, I should really focus on ability diversity as well, right? It's an insight that I had just in the quick 2 minute introduction that you had. Is when we think about diversity, we have to think about it as all encompassing. So making sure that every voice is represented is incredibly important, especially at a policy level. The second thing that I will say is, in order to be a great futurist, you have to be an incredible historian. History is all about uncovering patterns, and building the future is all about learning from those patterns and bringing those patterns with us into the future, carrying those patterns. Now, whether that's learning to carry patterns, creating policy that disrupt or do away with the old patterns that no longer work for us, or carry the patterns that have worked with us and carry them into the future, it's incredibly important to understand history. So oftentimes when we're looking 10 years into the future, we're looking back 50 years into history. And so knowing the history, knowing the understanding and the patterns that arise out of that historical context are going to be important even at the policy level.
Thanks, Gabe. I think we have one or two questions from the attendees.
Yeah, so Matthew says, Gabe, would you say your future is foreseen if you know the core of yourself or the person with disability as well? Matthew, thank you for that question. I think if you know yourself or the person with disability, I think there's a strong indication of where the future could head. But the whole point of futures thinking is to not just tie yourself to one future. What are the multiple futures that could exist? What are the multitudes? What are the multiple possibilities that exist out there? And knowing yourself, knowing the person with the disability that you're trying to address in the future, how do you create and respond and build resiliency for that person? So oftentimes we build alternative scenarios. The most common are 4 scenario archetypes: one of growth, one of collapse, one of constraint, and transformation. So oftentimes, Matthew, we will pick a person, let's say a person with a certain disability, and we say, how does this person win or lose in a world of growth, in a world of collapse, in a world of constraint or transformation? What are the opportunities? What are the threats? And so in a sense, it's not trying to predict the official future. It's trying to understand what are the possibilities for response, regardless of what the future is.
Really love that. Can you just repeat that one more time? Kind of those different areas that you try to wrap around people.
Absolutely. The 4 archetypes. So growth, right? What is the current, oftentimes growth is what is the current model and how will it exponentially grow, right? Oftentimes we talk about who is the winner in this world and what is their journey on their pathway to growth. We talk about collapse. Collapse is thinking about a system with something inherently broken. And collapse is all about understanding how far and how exacerbated does the system have to get until it completely collapses. And as it falls apart, who wins and who loses? Even in a collapse scenario, you have winners and you have losers. Transformation is all around a world-changing insight. Transformation is oftentimes it can be a certain technology, it can be a social sentiment, but what is going to transform? What is going to inspire us to act in a new way that we've never acted in before? And again, who wins and who loses? And constraint, finally, is understanding that there's a common threat to the whole system. And how do we learn to balance the parts versus the whole? How do we learn to create balance in a system of constraint to make sure that everyone wins, to make sure that everyone goes into the future? Again, in constraint, you still will have winners and losers, but it's about understanding a common threat and understanding bringing balance to the system. So growth, collapse, transformation, and constraint.
Man, that is really appropriate for I imagine any community. I feel like the disability community definitely so, and that can apply. That can be put on exactly where we are and have been over many years and decades, and where we will go into the future.
Absolutely, Jordan. I think as we think through, policy, especially if there's policy being proposed at this conference or just ideations of policy, right? Think through, if the world, let's just pick a topic, right? Let's just say the future of work. There's been a lot of innovation and a lot of disruption to the way work is done over the last 2 years because of COVID. We could say, in a world of growth where work from home continues to grow exponentially, is that positive or is that negative for people with certain disabilities? We could say, in a collapse scenario, COVID collapsed everything, right? It almost seemed like we got into a couple different places where we thought the entire system was going to collapse and fall out from under us. Right? How do people with disabilities lose? How do people with disabilities get threatened in that kind of world? What is that risk of being lost? And transformation and constraint, right? Think through at a policy level. What does this mean at every stage? How do we respond and how do we build either safety nets or plans of resiliency in order for people with disabilities to be able to thrive and to continue to bring them into positive futures, regardless of where the future ends up going?
Oh, that is beautiful and wonderful, and really, I think captures a lot of what we're trying to accomplish with this conference. Gabe, thank you so much for joining us from the Institute for the Future in Silicon Valley, and really giving some tools and frameworks for us to follow as we go forward. Gabe, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you all.